live at YouTube. Please, Professor Itala, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be the chair of this last session of the new Perspectives in Philosophy of Religion event. And now I want to introduce Professor Eleanor Stamp, who will be the next speaker. Professor Stamp is the Robert J. Henry Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University. She's also honorary professor at Wuhan University, the Logos Institute and School of Divinity at St. Andrews and York University. And she's a professorial fellow at Australian Catholic University. She has published extensively in philosophy of religion, contemporary metaphysics, and medieval philosophy. Her books include Aquinas, published in 2003, Wandering in Darkness, Narrative and the Problem of Suffering, published in 2010, and Atonement, published in 2018. Her book, The Image of God, The Problem of Evil and the Problem of Mourning, will appear in next 2022. She has given the Gifford Lectures, Aberdeen, 2003, the Wilde Lectures, Oxford, 2006, the Stewart Lectures, Princeton, 2009, and the Stanton Lectures, Cambridge, 2018. She is past president of the Society of Christian Philosophers, the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and the American Philosophical Association Central Division, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2021, she was given the award of Johanna Quandt Young Academy Distinguished Senior Scientist by the Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. Many thanks, Professor Eleanor Stamp, for having accepted to participate in this meeting. We are very honored with your participation. And so we are hearing your talk, The Problem of Mourning.
So thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be with you today. And I'm grateful to all the organizers of this conference for their good work in bringing this to pass in this time where we gather by Zoom. So I'm very pleased to be with you on this occasion. So the problem of evil is so perennial a topic in philosophy that it sometimes seems an icon for philosophical puzzles that cannot be solved. Only the most tendentious would deny that there is suffering in the world. How is this suffering to be explained? How could there be an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God in this world, given this vast panorama of human suffering? From the ancient story of Job to the most recent efforts at theodicy, there have been many varying attempts to come to grips with these questions. In other work, I myself have tried to delineate a successful defense against the argument from evil. But what is much less noticed in connection with the problem of evil is what would be left still unexplained if any of the attempts at theodicy were successful. In this lecture, I want to try to explain what this leftover problem of evil is. And then I want to explain what the traditional Christian response to that leftover problem has been. In this short lecture, I will not be able to do more than sketch both the problem and the traditional response. But I hope to show that there is an important part of the problem of evil that merits much more discussion than it has so far received. As the story is told in Judaism and Christianity, in the beginning, God created everything that there is in the world, and when he had finished creating it, he saw and said that all of it was very good. In the beginning, in other words, there was only innocence and harmony within all of creation, which was not only very good, but even beautiful. The point of this part of the common theological story is to make clear that God is not the creator of human beings as they are now. As God created them in the beginning, in their origin, human beings were like God in being perfectly good. They hurt nothing, at least not willingly, and they were lovely in all that they did. According to the story, the fact that human beings are no longer what they were when God created them is their own fault. The doctrine of original sin is the theological doctrine that is supposed to explain this claim. The human beings God created broke their relationship with their creator, fell from their original righteousness, and in consequence changed their own nature. They turned themselves into creatures with dispositions to will and to do what is harmful or unjust to others. Furthermore, the new nature of these fallen human beings was transmissible and so was reproduced in all their descendants. From this fall, there arose all of the misery in the world as we now know it, everything from the lamentable tendency to evil lurking in every human being to the actual horrors perpetrated on whatever is vulnerable or otherwise open to oppression and depredation. On the doctrine of original sin, then, the current condition of human beings is attributable to human beings and not to God. Nonetheless, on Christian theological doctrine, contrary to what one might suppose, God does well. God does well to allow this change in his original creation. That is because the fall and its resultant suffering are not the end of the story of the creation or of human beings and their relationship to their creator. In his goodness, God finds a way to save human beings from their evil and its consequences, including the liability to shame, guilt, and suffering. Through the life, passion, and death of Christ, God saves human beings from their post-fall human condition and brings them to union with himself, so that the human part of creation is not irretrievably ruined. In fact, it's part of the same story that in the end, the final end of the story of creation, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, so that all creation will somehow be restored to the condition of beauty and goodness that was part of God's original plan for creation. Now, suppose, just for the sake of argument, that this entire theological story, the story of creation, original sin, theodicy, redemption, and the restoration of a new heaven and earth, suppose that whole theological story is true. That's a lot to suppose, of course, but here's the point of the exercise. Even if this whole story is true, why does it not simply raise the problem of evil in a new form? Why does it not leave something that should be mourned? Why doesn't the problem of evil arise again as the problem of mourning? In this lecture, I want to show you what this problem of mourning is, and I want to show you the considerations that might help solve it. I won't be able to do more than that in this short time, but I hope that's enough to show you fruitful avenues for future research. To see this largely unremarked problem of mourning, consider the story of the post-fall world from the perspective of the creator in the story who first pronounced his creation very good. It may be that the creator can redeem the history of his broken world so that in the end it is restored to the creator's original plan for it. But why should the creator not see the whole story with the human horrors in the middle between the good beginning and the redeemed end? Why should the creator not see this as a damaged version of what the creator had in mind when he originally created heaven and earth? Why should the creator not find his creation, even redeemed and restored, something worthy of mourning? Or think about the question this way. The biblical book of Revelation predicts an end time of great peace and beauty and joy when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. But this time is supposed to come after the apocalyptic destruction of the earth and the great suffering of human beings during the end times. Even if it's possible to show successfully that destruction and suffering are defeated by the good of the new heaven and the new earth, wouldn't it have been better if the first heaven and earth had remained in their original goodness if there hadn't been the intervening apocalypse? We can focus in from the extended mural of all human history to the details of particular human lives and raise an analogous question with respect to individual human beings. Take, for example, Harriet Tubman. She was born a slave in the American South, and she suffered greatly as a slave. Eventually, she escaped, and she spent all her long life helping other slaves to escape, often in very difficult circumstances. In other work, I have argued that her suffering was defeated for her in the luminous excellence of her life. Through her suffering, she became the person so many people, me included, are now glad to honor. To say that her suffering was defeated for her is to say that given the nature of post-fall human beings, there was a benefit from her suffering. That benefit came primarily to her. It wouldn't have come without her suffering, and it significantly outweighed her suffering. Suppose, just for the sake of the argument, that this complex claim is true in all its details. Then it will be true that given the post-fall human world, God was justified in allowing Harriet Tubman's suffering, and that she herself would have had reason to think so if she'd known the whole story. But consider what remains sorrowful about her life even so. The suffering of her early life under the abuse of her slave masters lived on in her memory. And more to the point, it also lived on in the wounds on her body and in her psyche. And then there are the consequences of the deprivations she endured. She was not allowed any education in her formative years, for example. A deprivation of nurture for the mind is a lasting suffering. What might she have been if she had learned to read as a child? And what is it like to know that those around you whom you admire have a power of mind derived from education that is permanently lost to you because of the great injustices done you by your oppressors? Even if Harriet Tubman's suffering was defeated in the gloriousness of her life, the wounds and the scars of that suffering remain in her psyche for as long as she lives, and in fact, everlastingly in her life story. Because the past is permanent, her past injuries are permanent also. And so her life narrative includes the wounds and scars of those injuries forever. As far as that goes, there's biblical warrant for supposing that Christian theology must be committed to the view that even the physical wounds and scars remain in the afterlife, in the resurrected body. Consider in this connection the only set of stories in the New Testament that give detailed information about a resurrected human body. These are the stories about Christ during his earthly life after his resurrection. And these stories, the resurrected body of Jesus has still the wounds of the crucifixion. And the wound in the side of his resurrected body is large enough that an adult human hand can be put into it. If the resurrected body of the incarnate Christ keeps its wounds, then it seems that a fortiori Christian theology is committed to the claim that the wounds and the scars of the bodies and the psyches of all other human beings also remain in the resurrection of the afterlife. So why is it not the case that there is something disappointing, something worth mourning about God's creation with the fall and all the subsequent suffering in the story? Why is there not something sad at best or devastating at worst about the lives of human persons in the post-fall world even if those persons are redeemed and restored in the end? Why is it not the case that every human life is a depressing or distressing variation on the beautiful thing it might have been, or even in some cases a deplorable monstrosity by comparison with the life that it could have been? Why should we not conclude that the whole story of the world is a broken version of what the original creation was supposed to be on Christian doctrine? And an analogous question arises for individual human lives. Would it not have been better for Harriet Tubman if she had lived the sort of life she would have had, could have had, if she had been part of the creation as on Christian doctrine it was originally intended to be by the Creator? For these reasons, even if it is possible to justify God's allowing the suffering of post-fall human beings because the suffering is defeated by an outweighing benefit, something still remains to wonder about it. How is a theological story intelligible if it posits an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God whose creation turns out to be a defective version of what God intended it to be? How is it to be understood if even a redeemed and restored creation still merits grief? We can think of the ordinary problem of evil as generating a defeater for the theory that is the worldview of Christianity. And then a theodicy can be understood as a defeater for that defeater, because a theodicy constitutes a rebuttal against the argument from evil. But now, the problem of mourning can be seen as a defeater for the defeater, which is the theodicy, and is meant to be a defeater of the defeater that the argument of evil is for Christianity. On this complicated way of thinking about the matter, even with a theodicy, even with an acceptable interpretation of the doctrine of the atonement, the claim that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God seems undermined by reflecting on the distressing condition of creation. The post-fall world seems to be a damaged version of the creation as God originally made it and meant it to be, and that theological concession can itself appear to undercut the success of any theodicy or defense against the argument from evil against theism. Consequently, although it has been largely unnoticed in contemporary discussion, it seems that there would be something left over of the problem of evil. There would be something to mourn, even if there were a successful theodicy. What is surprising to see is that the Christian tradition has taken just the opposite view of the matter. It reads the story of creation this way: the creation with Adam's fall in it and all the suffering which the fall brought into the world made God's creation better, more glorious than it would otherwise have been. That is, the story of creation with the fall in it is more of a success for God than the story would have been had there been no fall and no evil in the world. I'm going to call this claim the Felix Culpa view, after an early liturgical text, the Exultet, which uses this phrase Felix Culpa to summarize the Christian view in question. Speaking of the fall of Adam, with theological audaciousness, the text of the Exultet puts the view this way: "O truly necessary sin of Adam, destroyed completely by the death of Christ. O happy fault, Felix Culpa, that earned for us so great, so glorious a Redeemer." This same perplexingly bold attitude toward the story of the world with the fall included can be found centuries before the appearance of the Exultet. In fact, it's evident from the earliest days of Christianity. To take just one biblical example, in the New Testament book of Acts, when some of the apostles are imprisoned and then beaten for bearing witness to the events of Christ's life and death, the biblical text says that they came away from this suffering rejoicing, with a sense of having been honored and being allowed to endure that suffering. In their view, their suffering was something to celebrate. In the patristic period, it's not hard to find expressions of this view. An attitude like that of the Felix Culpa kind can be found, for example, in the letters of John Chrysostom to his friend and companion Olympias. When Chrysostom was sent into exile by the empress who was angry at him, Olympias had a hard time enduring her separation from him and her worry about him as he was marched by soldiers through rough territory in challenging circumstances. We have a number of his letters to her written while he was on that march, and the overarching theme of those letters is his attempt to persuade her to something like the attitude underlying the Felix Culpa view. In his letters to her, he is concerned that Olympias see the suffering caused both of them by Chrysostom's exile as a kind of gift of God's to his more trusted, his more advanced people. To take just one of the many examples that might be given, Chrysostom writes to her, I would like to speak about something else that may seem paradoxical, but is true. If someone accomplishes a good thing, great and noble, but without having pain or danger or suffering, his reward will not be very large. For this reason, the Apostle Paul, when he boasted, did not boast only of the noble acts of virtue that he had done, but also of the evils that he had suffered. He did not say, I preached the gospel to such and such people, but rather, leaving aside his acts of virtue, he enumerated the evils that he had suffered, saying, in toils more exceeding abundant, in stripes beyond measure, in prisons more frequently, in danger of death often. Do you see this series of sufferings and the occasion for his boasting? Then he adds to these his works of virtue, but again, the sufferings have the greater importance, not the virtuous acts. That's what Chrysostom says to Olympias. In another letter, Chrysostom concedes the correctness of Olympias's concerns about him, and he acknowledges the trials and afflictions he's enduring on his march into exile. But speaking about the sufferings he's enduring and all the suffering he's experiencing, he says to her, remembering all of them every day and having them always in my mind, I leap for joy as having a great treasure in reserve. And this is why I beseech you to rejoice in all these things, to be glad, to leap for joy, to glorify God who has deemed us worthy to suffer these things. And elsewhere in his commentary on the Gospel of John, Chrysostom sums up the view that he's given Olympias in his letters. He sums up that view by saying of people who are scandalized at the sight of human suffering, he says, those people don't know that to have these sufferings is the privilege of people especially dear to God. Now, it's one thing to note that Christianity adopted such a view early on and stayed largely committed to it. It's another thing entirely to try to understand why. How could the world with all the evil in it be somehow greater, more beautiful, more worth having than the world would have been if it had gone as God originally intended? How could the life of a human person such as Harriet Tubman be better, more glorious than it would have been in a world without the fall? If wounds and scars remain even in the resurrected body of Christ, why would a resurrected human body not be more beautiful without them? The issue highlighted by these questions is in fact a corollary of a more fundamental issue, namely the nature of the true self of a human person. Think about the matter this way. If on the Felix Culpa view, a human person such as Harriet Tubman is more glorious in the post-fall world than she would have been in the world without the fall, then what is it to be glorious as a human person? On Christian doctrine, you are able to be made glorious and perfected in the post-fall world, but what exactly are you? There are multiple theories that might be thought to explain the notion of the true self of a human being, but in the end, I think that the notion of the true self can be understood best by delineating the nature of suffering and then, as it were, reverse engineering the notion of the true self from the nature of suffering. We can begin by noting that suffering cannot be adequately glossed just as pain, as a little reflection shows. On the contrary, pain is neither necessary nor sufficient for human suffering. Instead, it's arguable that suffering is a function of what a person cares about. Every human person has some care about what kind of person she is and about her being what she ought to be, or what she ought to be as something like thriving, as a good specimen of the species human being. Consequently, part of what it is for a human being to suffer is for her to be kept to one degree or another from thriving in this broad sense. What makes a human person thrive, however, is an objective matter. And so there is an objective element in human suffering. On the other hand, what human beings care about has a subjective element too, which does not have to do just with thriving. This subjective element is something to which a person is committed, but which need not be essential to her thriving, and which might not even be compatible with her thriving. This is a matter of the desires of the heart. It is not easy to give a crisp formulation of the notion of the desires of the heart. But we can say the desire of the heart for a human being is a particular kind of commitment, a commitment to a person or a commitment to a project. It's a particular kind of commitment which matters greatly to her, whether or not it has anything to do with her own thriving. Consequently, if we take suffering to be a function of what a person cares about, then suffering can be understood this way. A human being suffers when she fails to thrive, or when she fails to have the desires of her heart, or both. We can use this view of suffering as the basis on which to sketch an account of the true self. Think about it this way. If in heaven a human being is her true self in its perfected state, and if in heaven she does not suffer, then in heaven she has harmoniously ordered both her thriving and her heart's desires. That is, she has the convergence of what she cares about on both an objective and a subjective scale of value. So we can think of the true self of a person then as the emergent condition of that person when she has what she most cares about in both an objective and a subjective sense, and when her deepest heart's desires converge with her thriving. The true self of any human being thus has both an objective component, which is the same for all human beings, namely thriving as a human being, and also a subjective component, which will vary in some respects from one human being to another. Furthermore, the true self will not be a sum of the objective and subjective components. Rather, it will be what emerges from the interweaving of a human being's thriving with the fulfillment of her heart's desires. Consequently, the perfected version of a person's true self is what she is when what she most cares about, in both an objective and a subjective sense, converge in her and in her life. We can fill out this delineation of the true self by considering that on Christian doctrine, human beings are made in the image of God. The perfection of a human person's true self will thus also be the fulfillment of that image in her. But something is an image of something else in virtue of somehow resembling it. To be in the image of God, then, is to resemble God in one way or another. The perfection of a human being's true self will therefore also be an intensification of that resemblance in her. We can think about the resemblance between a human being and God in different ways, because on Christian doctrine, God is triune. That is, God is one and only one deity, and yet there are also three persons in that one God. That's the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. So a human being can be considered to be made in the image of God in virtue of resembling somehow the nature of the one deity. Or, on the other hand, a human being can be supposed to resemble God in virtue of somehow resembling the three persons in their loving interactions. Both of these ways of thinking about the image of God in human beings are well represented in Christian theological thought. But there is yet one other way to think about the image of God in human beings. On Christian doctrine, God is also incarnate in Christ. On the Chalcedonian formula for the incarnate Christ, Christ is one person, the second person of the Trinity, with two natures, one fully divine and one fully human. The things predicated of Christ in his human nature are predicated of the second person of the Trinity. And since each person of the Trinity is God, the things predicated of Christ in his human nature are also predicated of God. And that is why it is true on Christian doctrine to claim that God suffers, even though in his divine nature it's not possible for God to suffer. So yet another way to think about the image of God in human beings is to consider the resemblance between a human being and Christ in his human nature. In the Gospel of John, it's evident there's biblical warrant for the Christian claim that the incarnate Christ is most glorious in his crucifixion. That is the explanation typically given for why the wounds of the crucifixion remain in Christ's resurrected body. In fact, on Christian doctrine, the nature of God is most manifest in the crucified Christ. That is because the only divine attribute picked out in the New Testament as expressive of God's nature is love. The Epistle of John says God is love. And there is biblical warrant in the Gospel of John for the claim that there's no greater love than the love of a person who lays down his life for the sake of another. So on this way of thinking about the matter then, the nature of God is most evident in Christ's crucifixion because love is greatest and most evident there. Consequently, it is possible to see a third way of identifying the image of God in human beings. If it is the image of God in human beings that perfects the true self of a human being, and if the nature of the love that is God is most evident in the crucified Christ, then there may be some way in which the wounds of human suffering could intensify the image of God in a human being too. There is plenty of evidence in New Testament texts that the early Christian writers of the texts took this attitude. So, for example, in the epistle to the Colossians, the Apostle Paul says, I rejoice in my sufferings for you. I fill up that which is wanting in the afflictions of Christ. And in the epistle to the Romans, Paul says, we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and heirs with Christ if we suffer with Christ, that we may be glorified with Christ. If these suggestive lines can be philosophically explained, then it may be possible to see a way in which the wounds of a person's suffering could become for that person an image of God. On this way of thinking about the perfection of the true self of a human person, what perfects a human person is her resemblance to the incarnate Christ when the love of God is most manifest in the incarnate Christ. So here is how I want to sum up what I'm saying. There is a perplexing problem of evil, the problem of mourning, which remains even if there is a successful theodicy. The traditional Christian resolution of this problem of mourning is the Felix Culpa view, namely the view that the post-fall world with all its suffering is better than the world would have been if it had been what God originally created it to be, and there had never been a fall. This claim implies a comparative evaluation of worlds. And like the comparative evaluation of whole world views, a comparative evaluation of worlds is difficult to assess. But the problem here can be approached more easily by considering the smaller scale comparative evaluation of individual human lives. On the Felix Culpa view, it is possible for a post-fall human being in his true self to be more glorious than he would have been in a world without a fall. That is, in a world without the moral evil and the suffering of the post-fall world. This smaller scale comparative evaluation requires some understanding of what is being compared. Evaluating the Felix Culpa view, that is, requires some insight into the nature of the true self of a human being. It's arguable that the true self of a human being is the emergent condition which results from the convergence of that human being's thriving and the fulfillment of that person's deepest heart's desires. When that emergent condition is perfected, then on Christian doctrine, the image of God which is in human beings is also perfected. With that much beginning elucidation of the nature of a human being's true self and its perfection on Christian doctrine, there is then a clue about how the Felix Culpa view should be understood and how it could be defended. If the love that is God's nature is most evident in the wounds of the incarnate Christ, and if the wounds of human suffering could be suitably connected to Christ, then there would be a basis for an argument that the wounds of a post-fall human being can render that person more in the image of God than he would have been had there been no suffering in the world. In that case, on Christian doctrine, there would be something more glorious about redeemed human beings with wounds than there would have been had there been no fall, no suffering, no wounds or scars. On this view, it's the image of love incarnate that makes a wounded post-fall human person more glorious in his true self than he would otherwise have been. And the image of love incarnate in the true self of a human person would have been less in a world without a fall and without suffering. In the end, then, the last and most perplexing part of the problem of evil, what I have called the problem of mourning, which remains even if there is a successful theodicy, that last perplexing problem is inextricably interwoven with the notion of the true self of a human being and with an understanding of the nature of God as love. If the true self of a human being is perfected when the image of God is most fulfilled in him, and if the nature of God is most manifest in the love of God, then we may be able to see how the Felix Culpa view could be defended and how this form of the problem of evil might find a resolution. So here's what I want to say just to sum it all up. There's an important problem of evil that merits more discussion than it has so far received. In this lecture, I've tried to show what this problem is, and I have just sketched the basic lines of the traditional Christian response to it. To deal with this problem and this traditional response in detail and in depth would take a lot more work. But I hope to have done enough here to show what the problem of mourning is and to indicate something about the issues that this problem raises. In my view, this is a very fruitful topic for future research in the philosophy of religion. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Stamp. Many thanks. I'm opening for questions, suggestions, comments.
If you have a question, please put your video camera on, because it's much nicer to see a face in conversation than a black screen.
There is a question, a written question here in the chat by Mark Stephen Pandam to everyone, for you. Am I understanding you right, Dr. Stamp, that the dynamic togetherness of human thriving and pain might be the state of affairs in which human nature is most perfectly fulfilled?
So I appreciate this question by Mark Pandan. I am not entirely sure I understand it, however. So let me answer what I think is being asked, but then I may need to hear this question asked again. So I in fact know Brother Mark Pandan, and I have heard many of his questions after my lectures, and I know they are always terrific. So if I'm not understanding them right, I want to hear it again. So here's what I think you're asking. Is there something on this view? Is there something about suffering? Is there something about wounds and scars of past suffering that can perfect a person on the Felix Culpa view? The answer to that question is yes, that is the point of the Felix Culpa view. The Felix Culpa view, which is found in Christian theology from earliest times right through the High Middle Ages and onwards, that view says something about human brokenness in this world can make a human person more glorious than that person would have been without the brokenness.
Mark, would you like to say anything? Where's Mark? No, he didn't reply.
He says in the chat.
Yes, yes.
He
yes.
does not need a follow-up question.
Yes. Any other question?
Professor Bruce, then I, then Ignacio, then Agnaldo.
I think you should take the non-Americans first, because these Americans are known to me and exchange with them is always possible. Let's take the non-Americans first.
Yes. That would be all, replied Stephen Pandan.
May I begin, Professor Itala?
Yes, yes, Giselle.
Okay, thank you so much for your lecture, Professor Stamp. The first, I have two questions. The first one, a more epistemological one. I cannot see the problem of mourning as a defeater, as you have put it. Wouldn't it be the case that the problem of mourning is a potential defeater instead of an actual one? In this case, Felix Culpa would be a deflector, because a deflector prevents some possible objection to become an actual one in the first place. Because there is a complete account within Christian tradition that deals with it and prevents the problem of mourning to become an actual defeater to Christian belief. What do you think of this?
It depends on how you're understanding the dialectic of the situation, but here's how I am thinking about it. For suffering to be defeated, we would expect these conditions to be met. There's a benefit for the suffering. There's a benefit brought about by the suffering. It goes primarily to the sufferer. It outweighs the suffering, and it couldn't be gotten without the suffering. Now, that last condition is the tricky one, because as theodicies are typically framed, they are in fact relativized to a post-fall world. Without highlighting it, they say in effect, given the post-fall nature of human beings, given the nature of the post-fall world, you could not get this benefit without the suffering. But the benefit in question is one that could be gotten if there had never been a fall. And so in a certain sense, there's a way in which that last condition is not met, even if there is what we usually think of as a successful theodicy, because that successful theodicy is relativizing the benefit to the post-fall world. The question then is there a benefit that comes to suffering that couldn't be gotten without the suffering? That is there a benefit which couldn't be got without the suffering, even in a world without a fall? So that it's true to say, simpliciter, this benefit couldn't have been gotten without the suffering, rather than relative to the post-fall world. And that's the sense in which I was thinking of the problem of mourning as a defeater for a defeater of Christianity, like that.
Okay, but my point was just that I thought that it could be just a potential defeater, because there's a complete account of how Christian tradition and Christian explanation deals with mourning, and it includes mourning as part of it.
That's right, Jeziel. If the Felix Culpa view could be understood, if it could be made successful, rational, plausible, whatever it might be, then it would, it would defeat the defeater and so on. I mean, but whether you want to think of that epistemically in one way or another, as I say, depends on how you see the dialectic. But that is the whole idea. If the problem of mourning is going to be handled, it will be handled by the Felix Culpa view. That is right. That's right.
Okay, thanks. I have another questions, but I'll let the debate go on.
Yeah.
Giselle, I think you could present your second question.
No, just because I would like to compare your view on Felix Culpa theodicy with that of Plantinga, because Plantinga thinks Felix Culpa theodicy is enough to deal with the problem of evil.
No. He's got a completely different approach. So Plantinga's idea is like this. Plantinga thinks that you can sum the value of possible worlds, any possible world which has an atonement in it, in virtue of having God become incarnate in human history. That world then becomes so valuable that it outweighs any other evil in it. And he thinks that's a basis for a theodicy. And I would say it isn't. It isn't the basis for a theodicy because, there's a million reasons why I don't think that's a basis for a theodicy. But he doesn't think a benefit that defeats suffering has to go primarily to the sufferer and so on. I mean, there are a lot of issues there. But in any event, he's presenting that view as a theodicy. He's not presenting it as an explanation for what is left over if you have a successful theodicy.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
That was a good question, Jeziel. It was a very good question.
I have a question.
Okay, Professor Fabio Bertato.
Thank you, Professor Stamp. A wonderful talk. I thank you very much. Can we say from a Christian perspective that in order for the human being to become the image of God in a more glorious way through suffering and Felix Culpa, that the first man, Adam, had to sin, it was necessary to sin for the effective actualization of his free will and make way for the other human beings?
No, that would be too much. What you could say is there would have to be something that is defective about human beings that requires the intervention of God as incarnate. But it wouldn't have to be that this particular human being sinned. It could have been something else. It could have been something else. But this part of the suggestion is surely right. If there had been no fall from original righteousness, if there hadn't been some wrecking of human beings, then there wouldn't have been an incarnation. And if there hadn't been an incarnation, then the Felix Culpa view wouldn't it wouldn't have a basis for its job in this discussion, something like that. So we don't need that particular act on the part of that particular human being, but we need something like it, in other words.
Okay, the exercise of the free will entails some possibility of the sin in order to this more glorious perfection of the human beings.
You need to have, if you don't have something wrecked, you don't have anything to fix. If you don't have anything to fix, you don't have the suffering of Christ. And if you don't have the suffering of Christ, you don't have God's love manifest in that way. You might have God's love manifest in another way, but you wouldn't have it manifest in that way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ney Braga, would you like to present your question?
Yes. My question is related to the question of animal suffering. So I think in the definition of suffering that Professor Stamp presented to us, maybe animals don't suffer, I think. So I would like to know, Professor Stamp, what you think of the question of the Christian response to the problem of mourning. And in this response, it seems that in the end of times, God will destroy this world and will create another world that is better. And there are some passages in the Bible that say that in some way the animals relationship between animals will be restored in this new creation. But someone who believes that the problem of mourning is a very big defeater for Christianity, this person can this person say that the problem of animal suffering is still unresolved by this solution?
Yes, the problem of animal suffering is unresolved by this solution. Absolutely. So in all my work on the subject of the problem of evil, I've made it very clear that the subject is limited, and in particular, it excludes the suffering of animals. And here's the reason why. In the discussion of the problem of suffering, generally central to any attempt to understand how to deal with it is some deep understanding of the psychological condition, the psychic condition, the inner life of the sufferer. But we have very, very limited understanding of the inner life of animals, a very limited understanding of the cognitive capacities of non-human animals and so on. In the last 30 years or so, the research on animal cognitive capacities, non-human animal cognitive capacities, on the social capacities of animals and so on, is just begun to explode. And it has grown enough so that we can understand how stupid we have been about it in the past and how little we understand even now. But as long as we understand so little, there's no point trying to speculate about it and to ask, what would redeem the suffering of non-human animals. We don't understand enough about their suffering or what kind of thing could redeem it. We don't understand. So what I think is either we need to acknowledge ignorance and set it to one side until we know more, or else we need to proceed species by species. What would redeem the suffering of baboons? and who knows a great deal about baboons who could help us understand it. And then we would need a whole book on the suffering and redemption of baboons. See what I mean? But at the moment, it seems to me to be foolishness to suppose we're in any position to make headway on that problem. So yes, all of this leaves the problem of animal suffering completely unresolved. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other question? Okay. I think that we could finish. Fábio?
Ignacio and Aguinaldo.
Sorry, Aguinaldo want to ask something?
Yes, Ignacio, I think Ignacio raised his hand before.
I'm not, okay, Ignacio, sorry. Please, your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Agnaldo.
Yes.
Thank you, Ita.
Yes,
Thank you,
there
Elena,
are 3 hands here. Huh.
for a wonderful
Ignacio.
lecture. The Felix Culpa is in the Exultet is tied to a very strong theological necessity. Do you think that theological necessity is required for solving the problem of mourning?
No, I think the Exultet, what do I want to say? The Exultet is a liturgical text and not a philosophical text.
Yeah.
And if you push the Exultet too hard, it looks as if it's saying, if Adam hadn't sinned, we wouldn't have had an incarnate deity, and then the world would have been a lot worse off. And it's quite clear, theologically considered, that you don't need the sin of Adam to get an incarnate deity. You know, I mean, God could have decided to be incarnate just to be company for human beings. So I wouldn't push the Exultet too far as a philosophical text. But what it's useful for is helping us see the general tenor of thought, which refused to suppose that the post-fall world is just defective. It's the Exultet helps us to see that there's a strong strand of thought that supposes the post-fall world is more glorious than it would otherwise have been. Not just in the Alban Plantinga way, because you can sum the value of the world and incarnate deities of infinite value. So whatever else you want to add into that world, as long as it's got something of infinite value, it's good. That's not the idea. That's not the idea. Anyway, like that.
Professor Agnaldo, Portugal?
At least one of your points, Professor Stamp, was that by suffering, humans become more similar to God as incarnated in Christ. So that's why suffering is overcome by this greater good. But wouldn't we be in danger of saying that the more we suffer, the better?
Yes, that's true. That I was trying to make sure everyone understood that in this lecture, I could just begin to give a sketch of how this view is supposed to go. But for sure and certain, a great deal more needs to be said, first of all, to ward off the idea that suffering is good in its own nature. The view, in fact, is that there remains something to mourn, something to lament, something to grieve, even if it is also a Felix Culpa. So that part has to be worked out. But the other really crucial part that I just gestured at and could not develop in this short lecture, the crucial part is this. It's not just that suffering by itself has this effect, but it's suffering that produces somehow a magnification and intensification of the image of God. And the image, the original for the resemblance, is meant to be Christ in his crucifixion, where the suffering is accepted out of love for the deity. So if you think about it in terms of what Christ if you think about the issue in terms of Christ's paradoxical sayings, what he says is, he who loses his life for my sake, and that we'll find it, that qualification for my sake has a whole, what do I want to say, there's a whole philosophical world tucked into it, which is important for the philosophical problem of mourning. So, I mean, fundamentally what I'm saying is, yes, you're right, there's a lot more that has to be said, just a lot more. And I would just like to say that 2 hours before this lecture began, I finished the book that says all of this stuff and sent it off to Oxford. It's done. So this was the abstract for a big fat book. That's what we had here today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Alexander, the last question, please. Alexander.
Maybe this goes under the head of the things that that are just you don't want to talk about right now because of limitations of time. But I was thinking, you know, I could accept all the beautiful things you said about the Felix Culpa and still not think, I still don't know the solution to the problem of mourning. Because yes, things are more glorious and the evils are defeated in this more glory and contribute this more glorious whole and so on, and this more glorious life for myself and for those I love. But they're still evil, so I should still mourn them.
Oh yes, that's a very nice thought, Alex. And I'm glad that you got in at the end of the line to ask this question. It would be, in my own opinion, what do I want to say? It's easier to see the point if you think of the ordinary problem of evil. Consider a theodicy and the ordinary problem of evil. If you have a theodicy that suggests that there's nothing to grieve about in ordinary evil, something's gone very wrong in your philosophy. For suffering to be defeated is not for it to cease to be suffering. Do you know what I mean? God forbid that a theodicy should be thought to try to push such a line. Suffering, a theodicy explains why God is justified in allowing suffering, but it remains suffering that God is justified in allowing. In the same way, for sure and certain, there is something to mourn, even if the Felix Culpa view is right. So think about it this way. Christ wept when he saw Mary of Bethany brokenhearted over the death of her brother. Christ wept. And nonetheless, what do I want to say? When Mary of Bethany saw what Christ's plan had been all along, instead of continuing to say to him, you know, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. When she saw the whole plan, she adored Christ, wiped his feet with the ointment and dried his feet with her hair. But nonetheless, he wept when he saw the sorrow over the death of Lazarus. So the problem of mourning doesn't take away tears, it encompasses them in a greater story of love. That's the response.
Many thanks, Professor Eleanor Stamp. I'm very sad that we have to finish.
The questions were terrific. We clearly could have kept this up a long time. I loved all of the questions from the first one by Mark Panda and to this last one by Alex Bruss. They were all absolutely terrific and very helpful questions. And I'm glad you let Alex in at the last. That was a great question too. So, yeah.
And thanks again for having accepted our invitation to participate in this meeting. It's an honor for us. It's an honor, and we expected to receive you personally in Brazil next time at our university, at the University of Campinas.
Well, thank you thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the lovely questions and the great session. It was so nice to get to know you by this means, and I look forward to another time when we can meet in person. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Our next speaker is Professor Ignacio Silva. Ignacio is an associate professor of theology and science at the Philosophy Institute, Austral University, Argentina, and co-director of the master and PhD programs on philosophy and the foundations of science at the same institution. He was formerly a research fellow at the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion and a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, University of Oxford, where he co-directed research projects involving scholars in more than a dozen countries in Europe, Latin, and North America. He holds degrees in philosophy and theology, and a major theme of his research is the understanding of divine providence in relation to research done in science, philosophy, and theology. His publications include work in philosophy of religion, science and religion, natural philosophy, and medieval philosophy. In addition to his research and teaching at Austral, he is an adjunct professor of philosophy of religion at the Catholic University of Argentina. Professor Ignacio, would you like to present?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Itala. While I share my screen, I'd like to thank Fabio and Cristiano as well for this wonderful opportunity.
Professor Ignacio will speak about unexamined assumptions in the contemporary debate on divine action. Okay, we have that.
Good. I hope you can all see my screen. As I was saying, I'd like to thank very much Fabio and Cristiano for putting up this wonderful conference. It's a joy to be here with all of you. And it's been long since I've been waiting and hoping that I could meet you personally, but at least we can meet now virtually. The wonders of the pandemics, I guess. Okay, so when Fabio invited me, I suggested, I've just finished writing this book. It's about to be published in September. So I thought that I could present it. He was happy to allow me to do so. So basically my lecture today would be summing up one of the main arguments in this book. So I'll start with it. Oops, sorry. So, unexamined assumptions in the contemporary debate on divine action. The challenges that a world full of contingent events bring to the doctrine of divine providence cannot be overstated. My goal in this volume is to address these challenges considering the relation between natural contingency and divine providence from the perspective of Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Christian philosopher, while actively engaging with recent philosophical and theological literature on divine providential action. That is, instead of considering those who deny the possibility of divine providence given the contingency of natural events, I will study proposals that offer the opposite approach, making use of this natural contingency to offer models for understanding divine providential action. In particular, I will consider what has been termed as the Divine Action Project, which started at some point in the 1980s and lasted for about 25 years, the offspring of which continues to spur today in numerous works on divine providence and action. Arguably, the main insight of this project was that contingency and indeterminism in nature are of great value to the created order, and that they are of significant value to theological discourses as well. Consider, for example, what George Ellis has to say about the existence of contingency and randomness in the universe. And now I get that. It turns out that biological systems, take advantage of the storm of randomness encountered at the molecular level. There is much evidence that molecular machinery in biology is designed to use that randomness to attain desired results. This is true also in terms of macro levels of behavior, and in particular, as regards how the brain functions. Randomness is harnessed through the process of adaptive selection, which allows higher levels of order and meaning to emerge. It is then a virtue, not a vice. There is an advantage, a benefit, for the existence of randomness and chance in the universe. A benefit that, as I hope to explain, God puts to good use. Contingency and indeterminism thus do not rule out the ever intimate presence of the divine in creation. They rather point to it, and to a certain extent require and demand God's providence. The argument I put forward in this volume then is simple in essence. The basic idea is that there are some unexamined assumptions about causality which lead to embracing an ultimately inadequate solution and representation about God. The concepts of causality and of cause used in the debate are, so I argue, deterministic. Hence, my argument continues, God depends on the natural order to act, leading to the conclusion that God acts as natural causes do. To counter these problems, I propose revisiting Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of primary and secondary causation and its relation to contingency and indeterminism in the natural world. Analyzing the theological turn in divine action models, Sarah Lane Ritchie from Edinburgh has valued Thomistic approaches to providential divine action as something of a gold standard, because these approaches emphasize that the fact that nature is always in intimate connection to and dependence on God, and hence both God and natural processes are fully responsible for natural events. Aquinas is adamant in this respect. Natural things do not produce their effects unless for the divine power. This simple statement encloses all his metaphysics of providence. God is present with his power within every natural happening and every natural process. And that very statement is what I explain throughout the book. As for the structure of the book, I begin my argument by seeking for criteria to assess providential divine action models in what I like to call a historical dig or excavation. Thus, in the first chapter, Digging for Criteria, I present a brief metaphysical history of divine providence, considering 4 episodes in the history of Western intellectual thought that offer models of divine providence. These episodes start in medieval Islam and Christianity, passing through early modern Europe and late 19th century and early 20th century, arriving to the current debate. This historical preliminary study reaches 4 different criteria, or better, desiderata, that inform the debates and that, I argue, can serve to assess the contemporary and future models of providential divine action and natural contingency. My point is that these historical episodes, even if distant in time from each other, are shaped by these metaphysical options or principles. First, God's omnipotence. Second, God's involvement in the workings of nature. Third, the autonomy of nature. And fourth, the success of natural reason and science. I show in this metaphysical history that thinkers throughout these episodes struggled to put together these 4 desiderata in their respected models of divine providence, having to juggle with them in their respected models of divine providence, And I suggest that Aquinas' model manages to hold the four of them. In the second chapter, Science and Providence Today, I present the fundamental notions of the debate surrounding providence and science, such as general divine action, special divine action, and explore the basic features of contingency, indeterminism, chance, and randomness. I address how these concepts are used to argue for divine providence through the workings of the created indeterminate order. To show why I think the debate is ill-formulated, I exemplify the main ideas guiding it by focusing on Robert Russell's model on quantum divine action, but also referring to John Polkinghorne's ideas on chaos theory and divine action, and Jeffrey Kaspersky's considerations of the laws of nature in relation to God's providential action in the world. I examine the philosophical and theological assumptions on causality and God that inform current discussions on divine providence, the major assumption being that the notion of causality is identified with that of determinism. In the third chapter, A Metaphysics of Natural Contingency, I start my argument bringing in Aquinas' metaphysical thought on nature in full display, investigating how natural causality works for Aquinas and providing a new and fresh assessment of his account of the four classical causes of the natural world: material, formal, efficient, and final. This analysis shows that the essential notion in the definition of a cause is that of dependence. This definition allows us to speak of contingent causes, which can be scientifically described in indeterministic or random terms, in the causing of their effect, a feature that is tightly tied with the fact that natural efficient causes fail at times in the producing of their effects. I suggest then understanding divine providence using this broader notion of causality as that upon which something depends. In the fourth chapter, A Metaphysics of God's Providence, I present how Aquinas sought to affirm the radical and continuous dependence of all things upon God as their cause. The chapter first focuses on Aquinas' doctrine of God as pure being in order to pave the way for his exposition of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, from which his metaphysical doctrine of providence springs. Following Aquinas, I argue that complete dependence of creatures upon God is fully compatible with the discovery of real causes in nature. Thus, one can argue for a God who, without disrupting the order of natural causes, governs providentially the development of the universe, acting in and through these created causes. The reader will find that the explanations in these two chapters are heavily based on a widespread reading of Aquinas' whole work, and not only on the loci classici of both his Summa. The benefit of this method will be a return to Aquinas rather than an exposition of an Aquinas-inspired Thomism, which is, as I argue by the end of the volume, the root of many misconceptions reading Aquinas. So in the final chapter, Aquinas Today, I argue that Aquinas offers the metaphysical principles for a solution to the questions raised by the current debate on divine providential action. On the one hand, Aquinas' account of nature is not totally and absolutely deterministic, allowing, for instance, for a reinterpretation of Heisenberg's understanding of quantum mechanics, which lies at the heart of many models of divine providential action today. And on the other hand, given Aquinas' account of God's causality, God can be said personally to be the cause of the particular and individual in creatures. My concluding remarks are dedicated to addressing some objections to Aquinas' ideas today and to how recent work in science and religion has engaged creatively with his thought. Today, I will present the main argument from the second chapter, in the second part of which I analyzed the unexamined assumptions that lie beneath the discussions in today's debate. As I said, The main motivation for the contemporary discussion on providential divine action springs from the willingness to explain away the famous problem that holds that it seems that were God to intervene within nature, God would be breaking, suspending, or simply not following the apparent lawful order of the created universe, what for many would imply an inconsistency in God's nature. In fact, the idea of God acting directly in nature seems to bring challenges to the autonomy of nature, and thus to the foundation of the natural sciences. Theological discourses have not been alien to these matters, with many a scholar attempting to formulate accounts of how to understand both that nature has its laws and regular actions, together with the claim that God can participate actively in the development of the natural and human world. The basic leading principle that guided the project and subsequent debate was the search for scientific theories that were amenable to discourses on divine providence and action, by offering some kind of ontological indeterminism. In the words of Robert Russell, the debate asks whether there are one or several areas in the natural sciences where science itself leads to a view of nature as including events for which the natural causes that contribute to them are insufficient to bring them about. If Christian theology is right in asserting that God guides the universe in ways that go beyond creation and conservation, then this principle suggests God should do so in a non-intrusive way, for which the universe needs to offer some kind of ontological causal gaps within which God could perform these types of action, interacting with creation without intruding or intervening the laws of nature. The search was thus for what Austin Farrer termed the causal joint, what Sarah Lane Ritchie has called one of the most significant problems in science and religion. American theologians Robert Russell and Thomas Tracy, for instance, explore the possibility of finding this joint at which God's causality would interact with natural causes in the indeterminism of quantum mechanics, suggesting that divine providential action could be performed through quantum events. John Polkinghorne argued for divine action through the input of information in chaotic systems. Arthur Peacock suggested models of top-down divine causation. Philip Clayton held that theories of emergence could be regarded as viable paths to think new models of divine action. And Nancy Murphy, together with George Ellis, proposed a model for divine action in the human brain through the openness that quantum mechanics offer. The basic idea of all these proposals is that nature offers, at least at some level of reality, the level will vary according to the author, indeterminacy, openness, potentiality, contingency, all of which are available for God. This natural character means that nature offers events that are insufficient to cause future events, or reversely, events that are not sufficiently caused by previous events. In these models, then, God would act directly to determine what is left underdetermined within the order of nature, choosing which outcome offered by the underdetermination of nature to bring about, without disrupting any law of nature, because the very laws of nature present this indetermination, openness, or potentiality. God, in Thomas Tracy's words, may act to ensure the occurrence of an event for which created causes are insufficient. Jeffrey Persp puts this idea thus: without some sort of openness or plasticity within the natural realm, there is nothing God can do that would not thereby count as a violation. The science of the 20th century seemed to offer theologians the causal joint that they were looking for. That is, the place where God's action directly impacts on the world. I want to argue that there are two philosophical assumptions and one theological conclusion that have not yet been thoroughly analyzed in the debate. Sorry. There you go. The first philosophical assumption is that the relation between a cause and its effect is and cannot not be deterministic. That is, causation is identified with determination in a strong sense. The second is that were God able to act in the universe whenever and wherever God wanted, the autonomy of nature in its actions would be endangered and with it the foundations of science. That is, God cannot intervene in nature because his intervention would mean that nature is not fully autonomous in its operations. From these two assumptions, the theological conclusion that follows is that God has to act in nature as other causes in nature, or as the saying goes, as a cause among causes. I contend that if these assumptions are accepted, contemporary models of providential divine action in the world can only conclude that God must be conceived as another cause among causes, leading to an impoverished conception of God who is ultimately bound by the so-called laws of nature. So the first philosophical assumption has to do with the relation between a cause and its effect. If one looks at how some authors understand causes to relate to their effects, one finds that a cause is that which determines the outcome of the development of a physical system. In this scenario, there can be no effect without a determining cause, since the effect cannot be something different from what it is. The cause deterministically causes what it causes. Thus, an effect that happens indeterministically, such as a quantum collapse or a genetic mutation, is simply not caused, or at least not fully caused, because it is not determined by its preceding cause. The key here is that there are no indeterministic causes at play in these events. There is rather a lack of natural causality that allows the quantum system to be indeterministic, for example. Robert Russell puts it clearly. NIODA, which is the search for non-interventionistic objective divine action, is attending to events where nature does not have sufficient causality to produce the outcomes that actually do occur. Explaining events as indeterministic events means introducing a break in the ontological causal chain in nature. Thus, future events are not caused and hence not determined by the natural deterministic causes. One may welcome this picture of the natural world, since it seems to allow for novelty in its historical developments. This novelty, however, remains unexplained in terms of natural causes, due to the lack of natural causality in the process of its appearance. There are no natural causes to explain it. There is a lack of natural causation, what means that causality is understood in terms of determination. Causation, in today's debate, is deterministic causation. My point is that even if the dilemma of providential divine action within a deterministic universe is broken by the indeterministic character of the universe posed by science in the 20th century, the notion of causality assumed in these discussions remains a deterministic notion. Causation is identified with determination, implying that causes are only to be thought of as deterministic causes. And hence my first assumption is proved. Now the second unexamined assumption I find affirms that if God is able to act providentially whenever and wherever God wants, then the autonomy of nature in its action is endangered, and with it the foundations of science. Some contemporary authors appear to argue that any appeal to divine providential involvement in the world would go against the powers of nature. There is a fundamental incompatibility between the view of God's providential acting in the universe and the view that there are autonomous natural processes occurring in the world. Given the deterministic notion of causality, these authors accept that to defend the autonomy of the natural order and the existence of real causal connections in that order, it is necessary to restrict God's causal power. Since it must be admitted that science is grounded in the regularity of nature and hence in its laws, these authors are led to think that it is necessary to deny or to reduce God's power to act in the world. The only way in which God could do something within the natural realm is that there would be a situation within the universe that would have no cause, that is, a place where nature does nothing. In these situations, hence, there would be no autonomous natural causation, because there would be no natural cause at all. Therefore, were God to act in these, there would be no incompatibility between nature's autonomy and God's power. Where there is natural causality, there cannot be special divine causality. In this sense, the necessity of explaining the autonomy of nature appears as an indication of some reduction in God's power or activity, and hence my second assumption is proved. These two unexamined assumptions, namely that causation is deterministic and that God's power to act in nature is opposed to the autonomy of nature, lead to what I believe is an unavoidable conclusion, that God has to be conceived as acting as another natural cause. Russell finds that God cannot be thought of as another natural cause, because, given the ontologically indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, the theory itself does not allow any natural cause to cause the collapse of the wave function. My question is, however, is it possible to consider God to be radically different from natural causes if God is seen as acting to complete nature's work and within nature's laws? The first issue to tackle is the meaning of the expression God cause among causes. After all, everyone involved in these debates would agree that God is a cause, in at least a similar way in which created things are also causes. One should consider here that the objection that God is taking to act as a cause among causes does not want to deny the fact that God is a cause or to affirm that God should not be said to cause. On the contrary, this objection means that it is not a good move to consider God to be acting as a created cause. The objection wants to emphasize God's utmost transcendence, stressing that when God acts, God is always causing as a primary cause and never as a created cause. The basic idea behind this objection, then, is that God should not be placed at the level of created causes, because doing so would mean denying or diminishing God's transcendence. Certainly, this objection is not meant to deny the possibility of God acting within the created order of nature as a cause, for example, in performing miracles, but to defend God's non-worldliness. My basic argument holds that the idea of requiring insufficient causation for God to act depends on a deterministic notion of causation that ultimately renders God to act as a cause among causes. In a sense, God is bound by these laws of nature, which, in the end, construe God as acting accordingly. Hence, God is conceived as acting according to the laws of nature, which rule the causation of natural causes, and hence somehow also rule how God causes within nature. Russell admits that God interacts with nature at the quantum level by means of a measurement event, particularly to the outcome of the measurement event. God, however, is limited to act within these kinds of events and within the laws that govern them. Of course, Russell will argue that since the interpreted theory tells us that there is no natural cause that causes the wave function to collapse in this particular way, God cannot be conceived as a natural cause, even if God is causing the collapse of the wave function within the parameters given by the theory. For Russell, the theory says that there is no natural cause. Therefore, God is not a natural cause. This argument leads me to an important distinction, which concerns how natural causes are conceived. On the one hand, according to Russell, natural causes are defined by the scientific theory. Hence, since the theory says that there is no natural cause, even though the theologian finds that God is the cause of the collapse of the wave function, God is not a natural cause. Lapney calls this the epistemological criterion for deciding on natural causes. On the other hand, a natural cause has its own kind of causality, which is ordered by the laws of nature, which in the end are expressed by the theory. Hence, natural causes come before the theory. Let me call this the ontological criterion for deciding on natural causes. The epistemological approach derives from the Copenhagen tradition, particularly from Heisenberg's epistemological ideas, who admit that the theory determines what is to be observed. Russell is taking this method in a strong philosophical manner, affirming the existence or non-existence of natural causes by accepting what the scientific theory says. In this strong epistemological approach, God is not a natural cause, one causing the collapse, simply because the interpretation of the theory says he is not. On the contrary, in the ontological approach, natural causes do not depend on a theory to be natural causes or to be identified as such. They simply are what they are and are discovered by scientists working with scientific theories. The question is then, what defines a natural cause to be such, if not the theory that describes them? A natural cause could be defined as that which, belonging to the natural world, acts according to its own powers, remaining within the limits of the natural order, which could be assumed to be described by the laws of nature. Hence, if God requires acting within the limits of the natural world, God would be considered as acting as a natural cause, although not belonging to the natural realm. Now, were we to use the epistemological criterion on created natural causes, there would be no way to evaluating the argument as a whole, given that it would be self-contained. The ontologically indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics tells us simply everything: what a cause is, which causes there are, which kind of causes we can find, and how they work. It thus leaves no other parameter of decision over it. Now, if we only allow a scientific theory to decide over what a natural cause is, we would risk not seeing outside that theory and finding different natural causes. This will inhibit the development of a new scientific theory to explain the natural world. Hence, the ontological perspective appears to be more appropriate to be used here. The epistemological criterion for distinguishing God and the created natural causes appears not to be good enough, and in the end, following the ontological criterion, God appears to be conceived as a cause among causes. Now consider this argument, but flowing from the second unexamined assumption I analyzed earlier. It seems that if one wants to hold that God could act within the created universe, the autonomy of nature in its causal power would be put into question. One must hold this reduced natural autonomy in this case because one would be assuming a fundamental incompatibility between God acting in the created universe and the universe having autonomous natural causal processes. Thus, in order to defend the autonomy of nature, God's causal power is restricted to where there is no natural cause. The urgency to find adequate ways to account for God's activity in the world forced scholars to identify God's causality with natural created causality. Thus, divine causality is at the same ontological level as natural created causality, implying that God causes as natural causes do. God is then forced to cause as a cause among causes, that is, as a created cause, accepting that ultimately God is bound by the very laws of nature to act within nature. After all, a natural effect in a natural world requires a natural cause, and whether it is natural or divine, producing the effect, it would be producing it on the level of natural causes. This whole debate arises because of the preoccupation with maintaining God's guidance and government over worldly events as described by our current scientific theories. This worry led participants in the debate to find ways in which God could providentially guide the universe through direct actions in the world. This search, however, involves assuming that God needs to be considered as acting as a cause among causes, a statement that is a major theological shortcoming for many. As I mentioned at the beginning, to counterbalance this shortcoming, I suggest recovering Aquinas' metaphysics of divine providential action. As I said, for Aquinas, natural things do not produce their effects unless for the divine power. That is, God is present within his power within every natural happening and every natural process. Still, this simple statement also brings about rightful question. What does it mean to say that natural things produce their effects because of divine power? How do we understand that natural things cause their effects because they are created causes and as such receive their powers from God? Or is it that God produces each natural effect without any input from natural causes? Or is it both, God and the natural causes that produce together the effect? Does God have to act so natural things can cause? Can God in the end act in nature at all if natural things are acting? I attempt at an answer to these questions in this volume, expanding on the following basic ideas. For Aquinas, God causes creatures to exist in such a way that they are the real causes of their own operations. Still, God is at work in every operation in nature. Divine causality and creaturely causality for Aquinas function at fundamentally different levels. God's causality is that of creation, while creature's causation is that of natural change. Thus, Aquinas understands that these two different causes differ radically. God is the complete cause of the whole reality of whatever is, and yet in the created world, there is a rich array of real secondary causes. Indeed, following his understanding of creation out of nothing, Aquinas affirms the integrity and relative autonomy of the physical world and the adequacy of the natural sciences themselves to describe this world. Particularly in his exposition of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, Aquinas sought to affirm the radical and continuous dependence of all things upon God as their cause, and that this dependence is fully compatible with the discovery of causes in nature. God's omnipotence does not challenge the possibility of real causality for creatures, thus rejecting any notion of divine withdrawal from the world so as to leave room for the actions of creatures. In fact, Aquinas does not think that God merely allows or permits creatures to behave the way they do. Moreover, creation out of nothing does not mean only that God creates being and allows secondary causes to provide the particular determination of individual beings. Creatures are what they are precisely because God is constantly present to them as the cause of their being in their actions. Thus, Aquinas affirms the same effect is not attributed to a natural cause and to divine power in such a way that it is partly done by God and partly by the natural efficient cause. Rather, it is wholly done by both, according to a different way. Just as the same effect is wholly attributed to the instrument and also wholly to the principal agent. Were God to withdraw, all that exists would cease to be. Hence, the autonomy of nature is guaranteed by God's creative continuous causality. The volume thus presents in length, depth, and with some amount of clarity, Aquinas' arguments concerning natural and divine causality. I attempt to show how Aquinas' account of providential divine action in nature is a viable option in today's debate, affirming with him that God is constantly providentially active in the contingency of the created universe, guiding the development of the history of the universe to its fulfillment. It is ultimately in this natural contingency where the intentions of the divine providence lies hidden for the glory of God, as Aquinas tells in his commentary to the Gospel of John. And that's all from me now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ignacio, for this so excellent talk. Very instigating, exciting. I liked it very much.
Thank you. The publisher told me there's a 20% discount if anybody's interested, but it's so expensive. Just tell your institutions to get it for you.
We can open the discussion. Who would like to present questions?
Tell if you.
Who is?
Agnaldo, it's me.
Agnaldo.
Again.
Okay, you had
Again.
the word. Okay, I have a question after. Okay, if you have time.
Oh, ladies first.
No, but
You begin. I come later.
Either speakers first, please.
So Ignacio, thank you so much for your presentation. I was thinking about the doctrine of first and second cause. It's attributed to Aquinas. How do you combine these two doctrines? The one you presented and that one of first and secondary cause.
Right. So the largest questions of all we throw right at the beginning, which is great. So today I presented my main argument against the framework of the contemporary debate, right? That was the major part of today's talk. What I do in the book, I follow up with a long presentation of Aquinas' account of causation. Natural causation first, and then divine causation. And then I present the doctrine of primary and secondary causation, right? To give an account that could solve the problems that I presented today. So Aquinas' doctrine of primary and secondary causation is fairly complex, is not very straightforward, but he likes to use the image of an instrument to explain it, right? So he uses the analogy of an instrument. He uses the image of an axe, and we can use the image of a pen, right, or a pencil, right? So a natural cause, analogically, a pencil, right, has the power to put, for example, the pencil or the pen, ink on a paper, right? But it requires the power of the principal agent, myself, right? God in the side of the other side of the analogy, requires the power of the principal agent to put that ink on the paper, right? The pencil itself could not do it on its own, right? So, of course, God goes by far beyond what I can do with the pencil. For Aquinas, God creates the pencil and the power of the pencil, continues to hold in existence the pencil and the power, the causing power causal power of the pencil, then applies the power of the pencil to action, right? Because the pencil requires the principal action, the principal agent. So puts the ink on the paper through the power of or by the power of the principal agent, but also goes beyond the power of the instrument, Aquinas says. And that's what I think it's very interesting. Because the pencil cannot write Agnaldo on a paper. In fact, the pencil does not have any power to write any meaningful thing. But the principal agent, myself in this case, by my power and through the power of the secondary cause, the instrument, can achieve an effect that goes far beyond the power of the natural cause, the pencil, right? Writing something meaningful, for instance, right? So in, I don't know, 3 minutes, I gave you a very short presentation.
Short introduction.
Quite a large.
A huge problem. Yeah, but you're still talking like in terms of teleology, aren't you?
Of course, yeah. You need to assume all of Aquinas' philosophy of nature, right, which follows very much Aristotle's. Though it has some differences, but yes, you need to accept natural teleology and causal powers and material causation and formal causation and so forth. Yeah. To understand, I think that's one of the main difficulties today in understanding Aquinas, particularly his theological, metaphysical doctrines, is that they are so tied to the philosophy of nature that he proposed, and people usually forget that philosophy of nature, that then it's very easy to misunderstand his theological doctrines. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Agnaldo. There is a question by Fabio Bertato. Fabio, could you to tell us your question? Fabio?
I just wrote the question. Ignacio can see the.
Okay, but maybe you could read it. Read the question, Fabio.
Okay. In terms of Aquinas' ways, would you say that God is the first cause without a cause, who in addition to causing each intermediate cause also causes the causal series as a whole?
Yeah. I think that's the basic idea of Aquinas' understanding of creatio ex nihilo, right? Everything that has any kind of existence is caused by God, so it's created. Only God is uncreated, right? And that's why nothing can create for Aquinas in the proper technical sense of giving being existence out of nothing, right? There's a whole debate on whether some angel, for instance, could create as and acting as a secondary cause, but as an instrument, yes, as I just explained. But that's very how can I say it? Very niche in Thomistic studies, right? But yeah, God ultimately is the cause of everything, and by being the cause of everything, is the cause of the whole causal chain as well as of every single chain, right? Because God is always creating. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ignacio, there is a question by Humberto Coelho, arrived from YouTube. Thank you, Dr. Ignacio Silva, for such an extraordinary lecture. Could you better distinguish divine agency from negative or God of the gaps arguments? Could you tell us more about human freedom and which sort of causality is it?
Right. So the God of the gaps argument basically says that God acts where nature doesn't act. Or, I mean, we can put it epistemologically, where science doesn't find any natural cause, right? It was very popular in the 17th century, and Newton had a big debate with Leibniz about that. The big problem with the God of the gaps argument is that science and our knowledge of the natural world continues to advance, so we keep on pushing God out of science or out of nature, right? So the main advantage, I think, in Aquinas's perspective is that it avoids that sort of argument, because Aquinas's argument does not need nature to offer gaps for God to act, right? God is always acting as the primary cause of the secondary created causes, being those secondary causes deterministic or indeterministic. Which brings me to the second question of human freedom, right? Human freedom is the paradigmatic example of indeterministic causation, right? I usually don't deal with human freedom. I leave that to people by far more intelligent than I am. I only deal with indeterministic, contingent, natural causes, right? Which are more manageable. But yes, so human freedom for Aquinas would be an indeterministic or contingent secondary cause. As such, it would also be caused by God, of course, but in a primary way, human freedom would not be then determined by that primary causation. Of course, this has all intricacies which we better don't get right now. But let me take the opportunity to say hello to Umberto, whom I know from long ago. It's wonderful to have him around.
Ignacio, I would like to have to say a foolish question, an observation. At the Center for Logic, we have an interdisciplinary group. We have worked during several years on complex systems, self-organization, and information. And we have studied several manuscripts and subjects written by Charles Sanders Peirce. And when you mentioned Robert Russell, I remember a very beautiful text I've read, written by Charles Peirce, where he claims that in nature there is chance, azar, acaso. And he claims that the chance is the freedom of nature. And from a certain kind of interpretation, we as human beings, we are a reflex of nature. And so our freedom could be understood as a kind of projection, reflection of the nature freedom. Sometimes when we say that you can't explain certain phenomena by causality, nature causality, when we think about a cause of causes, maybe we are speaking of this kind of chance that we could interpret as the cause of causes. What do you think?
Yeah, well,
Too full?
No. It's a wonderful reflection.
Crazy?
No, not at all. I mean, so as I said right at the beginning, one of the big highlights of this debate that I analyze on divine action today is the fact that the whole debate, this 25, 30-year debate, rediscovered the richness of indeterminism, contingency, right, chance, randomness in nature, right? I mean, there are also many arguments that would say, well, there's contingency, then there's no teleology, then there's no God, right? So this group of theologians and philosophers of religion put that upside down. They said, well, look, there is contingency, there is chance, so we can speak of God being involved in nature, right? That's one of the great things. Can we call it freedom? Well, analogically,
Persp call it freedom of nature, and he's against determinism even in nature.
No, I know. But I mean, can we call it freedom? Well, I mean, analogically, I think yes. The first experience of freedom that we have is our own, right? Human beings are free. Yeah, we have free will. And I think analogically, we can apply that term to other beings, right? And to nature as a whole. But of course, as any analogy, it has levels and these analogies as well, right? Freedom, the concept of freedom usually includes the concept of decision, right? Of a will that decides. So bonobos that we spoke today with Eleanor probably have a certain degree of freedom that a plant or a stone does not have, or even a quantum molecule, right? In terms of decision making. But yes, I think it's a great image to have and to have in mind and to rediscover. Of course, well, not of course, but Persp is not a voice in this dialogue, and it would be wonderful to have.
Yeah, to capture him, because
I don't know Persp myself, but
it's very interesting, very beautiful, very poetic. I like very much.
Yeah. Of course. That's more or less what I have to say about it.
Okay, we have one more question by Ney Braga. Would you like to ask the question, Ney? Where is Ney?
He might have left.
Yes. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Professor Silva. Question: do you think that the concept of divine intervention is in some way accurate to be applied in this discussion?
Right. So this guy, Robert Russell, I mean, he's a wonderful, wonderful person. Doctorate in quantum physics, doctorate in theology, incredibly knowledgeable. He has a very precise notion of intervention, divine intervention, which says that a divine intervention is when God breaks the order of nature, right? When God intervenes, stops a law of nature, right? And he wants to say, well, we don't want that. We want a model of divine action that avoids that concept of divine intervention. And so he offers this non-interventionist, objective divine action model, right? And it is non-interventionist because it uses what he sees the openness, yes, this lack of causality in nature to jump in. As I explained, I think that doesn't really work. It creates all these many problems for our traditional notion of God. We can change the notion of God. That's an argument that I look at in the book. I mean, Paul Kinghorn says, well, whatever, we don't need to keep our transcendent God, right? And he changes his notion of God. Okay, that's fine. But I think we could try to keep it. So, as I say, I think it creates too many problems. Now, I think that the greatness of Aquinas's model is that it includes a notion of indeterministic causality, right? Contingent causality, right? Which is not included in the contemporary debate. Causality is determination for contemporary authors, yeah, in this debate. If we can bring about a causality which is non-deterministic, then we don't need God to be intervening or acting in these non-interventionist ways, and we could simply avoid that problem. So yes, the concept of divine intervention is all over the place. People want to avoid it. I don't think they do it successfully. So yeah.
Okay. I'm afraid that we have to close your talk.
Excellent.
Once more, many thanks. And we have lots of things to think.
Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you, Fabio, Itala, and Esiel. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I look forward to more cooperations, right?
Yes, to maintain contact. Yes.
Good.
And now, yeah, it's a pleasure to announce our last speaker, the closure talk that will be issued by Professor Agnaldo Portugal from the University of Brasilia. He is an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Brasilia, where he has taught since 1991. He works mainly with the areas of philosophy of religion and philosophy of science in projects dedicated to the following themes: relationship between religion and science, religious experience, inductive reasoning, Bayesianism, and rationality of belief in God. He was president of the Brazilian Association of Philosophy of Religion between 2010 and 2015, and one of the coordinator of the Working Group on Philosophy of Religion of the Society of Theology and Religion Studies between 2011 and 2018. He's currently coordinator of the Group of Research in Philosophy of Religion at UNB, University of Brasilia. Professor Agnaldo will speak about some problems with miracles and a religious approach to them.
Thank you, Professor D'Ottaviano, for the introduction. Before I begin my talk, as we coming close to this event, I would like to say a few words about the significance of it. Since 2004, it's been a great effort to create a research community in the philosophy of religion in Brazil. It's been a long story. And when I received Dr. Fabio Bertato's invitation to take part in this project, I got very happy. And very, not only because of the event, which is a great honor to take part in it, but because the University of Campinas is one of the most important academic institutions in Brazil and in the Latin America. To see you at the Center of for Logic and Epistemology, interested in the philosophy of religion and doing an excellent job like this, is great news for this area of philosophy in Brazil. So congratulations for this event, and I hope we keep on working together. So let me start my lecture, and I hope it deserves the invitation anyway. So I'm going to start my. Are you seeing that? Oh.
Yes.
Are you?
Now, not yet the slide, but the beginning of the projection. Yes.
Yeah, something like that.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Okay.
So, miracles are not only an important part of many religious traditions, but also a current social phenomenon in various countries. Here below, you see a picture of Saint Sister Dulce, who was canonized in 2019. She was perceived by people in Salvador, Bahia, and in Brazil in general, as a saintly person because of her dedication to the poor, mainly to the children and the ill. She also was a big fan of football, soccer, as you call it in the US. Despite all these qualities, she was only canonized after the Vatican could have evidence of miracles performed through her. This is an example of how important it is for the Catholic tradition in Christianity. Above, you see some pictures of events on TV and live and in person by people, by some pastors in evangelical churches in Brazil who are attended by thousands of people, and both in TV and in person. Christian faith is centrally based on a particular miracle report, as you know, which is the resurrection of Jesus. On the other hand, Christian churches are accused of using miracles as a marketing appeal to gather more adherents so that they can get more money from their contributions. You see below in Forbes, the Brazilian session of Forbes put some pastors among those the richest people in the country. So that's a curious thing, and miracles play a very big part in that. So of such an important phenomenon, I propose both social and religious. I propose to discuss three main problems. The conceptual problem, what is the meaning of miracle? The epistemological problem, is it rational to believe in miracles? And I propose an ethical problem. Is there anything wrong in claiming that a miracle happened? So let's talk about them in turn. Although miracles are, so the conceptual problem first. Although miracles are a central part of Christianity and other religious traditions, the most common definition found in contemporary philosophy of religion is the one proposed by David Hume as a violation of the laws of nature. In this sense, a necessary condition for a happening to be called a miracle is that it is so uncommon that may be considered contrary to uniform natural order. However, this is certainly not a sufficient condition, since not all weird occurrence would be properly called a miracle. Hume himself seems to recognize this, and he puts in a footnote a crucial complement to his definition. So I quote, accurately, he says, a miracle is a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity, or by the interposition of some invisible agent. End of quotation. In other words, for a violation of a natural law to be a miracle, one needs a religious context. From a religious perspective, however, a miracle is an object of wonder, as the Latin noun miraculum means. This reaction of astonishment occurs in view of an extraordinary happening, which is viewed as a sign of God's power. Scientific puzzles emerge from a theoretical expectation, law-like regularities, and drive scientists' work in the search of understanding it. The appropriate reaction to a miracle is wonder and discernment of a deep reality, not curiosity and questioning. In this religious sense of miracles as signs of God's power, they are a form of his communication with humans in situations such as answers to people's prayers, attesting the divine presence, a certification that someone is a God's prophet. So I think defining a miracle mainly in terms of violations of natural laws is disregarding its religious essence. It's analogous to say that axioms are a boring way to start telling a children's story. It's not wrong to say so, but it simply misses the point as regards what an axiom is, which supposes a formal scientific context. So my first idea about the conceptual problem, it is that miracle is mainly a religious concept, which is the sign of God's power through an extraordinary event performed by him, by God. Let's move to the epistemological problem. These are the most discussed ones concerning to miracles in the analytic tradition, and can be divided in three, I think. The first of epistemological problem regarding miracles is about the rationality of believing in miracles in general. The second one is the rationality of believing that the specific happening was a miracle. And the third, I would call it the coherence between believing in miracles and the acceptance of modern technoscience. Let's take them in turn. Again, we can consider Hume's arguments as starting points for rejecting the rationality of believing in miracles in general. His criticism presupposes his concept of miracles as a violation of natural law. Hume's argument is that, one, I'm not very good in formalizing arguments. I was just an average student of logic, so people at Clay, please forgive me. So something like that. Since natural laws are strongly confirmed by empirical evidence, since the belief in miracles is based on testimony, and since testimony is much weaker than empirical evidence, because testimony reports are ultimately reducible to observations, then we can conclude the belief in miracles is ill-founded, and so irrational. So, in my reading, that's the basic argument against the rationality of belief in miracles, according to Hume. Those familiar with the epistemology of testimony will detect the reductionist step in 3, which bases testimony on sense perception. But recent discussion allows to think that the interaction between testimony and perception is not that unilateral, so that the former should be taken as a basic way of forming beliefs as well. So you don't only correct your testimony reports from perception. You sometimes correct your perception with testimony. When someone more reliable than you, for example, says, well, what you're seeing is not that what you're thinking you're seeing, you can change your mind about your perception from a testimony report. So there are at least some participants in this debate about testimony that says, well, the way Hume weighted the two elements in this balance was not fair, because you can think testimony in a non-reducible, reductionist way. However, the main premise in Hume's argument is one. Let's go back to it. Since natural laws are strongly confirmed by empirical evidence. Where the belief in laws is said to be strongly confirmed by empirical evidence. If a miracle is a violation of a natural law, let us grant that for the sake of the argument, then belief in miracles is irrational because violations of natural laws are very improbable. Now, improbability is not impossibility, and miracles are said to be very improbable happenings, but not impossible ones. So there shouldn't be no a priori problem in believing in them then. So the question here is that even if you take natural laws as very strongly confirmed by observations, and miracles are violations of it. Hume himself was skeptic about the necessity involved in natural laws, wasn't he? So why to think that is a priori irrational to believe in miracles, since there's no impossibility in that? Even if miracles are possible in principle, so that's my answer. Probably too quick. That's my answer to the a priori problem about epistemology, about the belief in miracles. But even if miracles are possible in principle, so the rationality of believing in them is possible in principle as well. I believe that specific happenings are really miraculous instead of enigmas for scientific research and future explanation. So why not thinking that, well, okay, you can believe in miracles in general, but tell me a specific miracle, and I will tell you that this is explainable for science one day. That can be so. So why not? Why think that this specific piece of this specific happening is a miracle at all? The first answer to this challenge that it presupposes the inappropriate concept of miracle from a scientific point of view, which I denied in the first section of this talk. So in this sense, a sudden and unexpected cure of cancer after an intense period of prayer may be explainable scientifically, And yet, the person who endured that experience may still be right in seeing it a sign of God's power in a wonderful way. So she, I think, is right in taking that as a miracle, even if it's scientifically explainable, because that will be a sign of God's power in a wonderful way. So it's very rare to be cured by cancer. This is a religious context. So I don't think there is anything wrong in taking that as a miracle, that specific happening as a miracle. So the religious interpretation of an extraordinary happening as miraculous does not prevent us seeing it as a puzzle to drive scientific research as well. So the belief that a certain very improbable occurrence is miraculous supposes a religious background, and it's not contradictory with scientific explanation. So viewing miracles from a religious perspective, so that was my answer to the second part of the epistemological problem. So let's talk about the third part, which is the incompatibility between the belief in miracles and technoscience. My idea is that viewing miracles from a religious perspective can also help to reply to the question about the compatibility with believing in miracles and the reliance in modern technoscience and its fruits. Since the idea is that the religious view is not contradictory with scientific research and its technology, that should not be a problem. Of course, if ontological naturalism is necessarily attached to natural technoscience, then the incompatibility would issue. However, as Alvin Plantinga said in that book here, naturalism is more appropriately seen as a metaphysical add-on than a part of scientific activity. And that's something that should be considered in that problem of divine action, as Inácio which Inácio talked to us about in the last lecture. Because what prevents God in the world, action in the world, what makes us thinking that it's an intervention could only be a kind of ontological naturalism that takes the physical closure in the world as part of nature instead of part of the scientific method. So why taking naturalism as part of science? We don't need to do that. So is that approach to miracles will problems from the epistemological point of view. The third problem, the relationship between miracles and morality, is a less usual discussion than the conceptual and epistemological problems. And I suggest two problems here. First one is something like, are miracles a good thing so that we could expect them as a result of an infinitely good God? Something related to the problem of evil. Stump some hours ago. And the second ethical problem with miracles would be something like, is there anything wrong in claiming that a miracle happened? So the first ethical problems with miracles would be put like this. First, miracles break the uniformity of natural events. Natural stability is a condition for knowledge and a fruitful life. The possibility of knowledge and a fruitful life is something we should expect from a good God. And fourth, miracles are something we should not expect from a good God. A possible answer to this criticism, this argument anyway, is that very rare phenomena. I said to be very rare phenomena. In this sense, they don't break natural uniformity in the sense of precluding scientific knowledge and existential realization. In fact, natural science deals with irregularities all the time. And a too predictable existential order would be a very boring and unchallenging one. So I don't see why rare occasion of a miracle would break natural order in the sense of precluding scientific research. Scientific research deals with enigmas. So we don't have a natural law as in a deterministic sense, and in the strong sense, as precluding, as not living together with problems. Actually, scientific activity requires problems, and they are not that harming to natural order, so that we cannot predict happenings or having control over our lives in a sense that would harm our freedom. So it is I can say that a world with miracles would be a challenging and both for in scientific terms and in existential terms. So one might expect from a God to act in exceptional occasions, I think, both from an existential point of view and a scientific one. A related issue to this is whether the fact that miracles happen only to a few would be compatible with an infinitely good God. A possible answer to that is to associate miracles to an eternal life theodicy. So, isn't it a discrimination that God affords miracles and miracle cures, for example, only to a few? A possible answer to that is to associate miracles to an eternal life theodicy. That is, a conception of God's redemption in an eschatological time, when there will be no more suffering and pain, not for a while, but for eternity. Miracle could be a sign of this future reality, given in order to encourage us to endure the hardship of this world and get more prepared for the and deep communion with God. Sorry. So instead of being a discrimination, if you take them as a sign, as I think it's the main component of the concept of miracle, this stops being a kind of unethical preference, unethical discrimination, becomes then a sign for a world to come. And then part of a theodicy, a particular theodicy, as I call it, as people call it actually, eternal life theodicy. Another ethical problem refers to the morality of claiming that a miracle has happened. Critics of the widespread display of miracles in religious TV programs and events see it as a malicious strategy to get money from socially vulnerable, desperate people. So the claim of miracle happenings would amount to fraud, cowardice, and greed. So this ethical problem with miracle refers to immoral deeds by people who claim to perform them or claim to make them happen, make them happen in their cults or in their TV programs or something like that. So how to deal with that, with this ethical problem regarding miracles? Well, in contrast with the malice attached with miracle claims in this accusation, Jesus is curiously reported to treat some of his own miracles with discretion. Oh, he says not to mention it to anyone. That happens, this secrecy is attached to only 5 out of 35 miracles that Jesus performed in the Bible. So what's the reason for this secrecy recommendation if Jesus' intention was to widespread the gospel and his miracles were a sign of it? So an answer to that ethical problem of miracle can be started with this curious point in the Bible. So why say to these people not to tell anyone about what happened here? Even if it's, in most cases, there was not that happened anyway. A possible answer to that, I mean, the compatibility between the secrecy recommendation and the widespread of the gospel, is the idea that instead of public external approval, those actions should be occasions for deepening an inner personal relationship with God. So that's something you can find in the Sermon on the Mount. The idea that you should not show everyone that you're fasting or giving almonds or that you praying. So that's something that, like the silence, that more shows that these religious acts should be not part of your vanity in the public, but part of your relationship with God, is something that I think is an answer to the problem of the secrecy and the compatibility with the widespread of gospel. So the secrecy surrounding some of the miracles performed by Jesus could be interpreted as an emphasis on the linguistic or communicative element included in the notion of a marvelous sign of God's power. So this piece of communication should keep its religious meaning instead of being downgraded into some financial or political advantage it may bring. In addition, the religion's approach to miracles may put more rigorous ethical patterns in the evaluation of miracle claims. If miracle reports are true, those we see on TV and public codes, public events, if these reports are true, see if they're not fraudulent. A non-religious moral assessment has nothing to reproach them as a making money method. So why not making money out of it? If people want to give money to have a miracle and to testify it, that's nothing wrong with that. From a non-religious point of view, I think. However, if a miracle report is true, point of view, it should even so be kept as discreet as possible, so not to harm its sacred significance, or at least its broadcast should have a religious meaning. And this is a reason for objecting for their use for financial purposes. So this religious approach to miracles would be even more rigorous against the ethical issues involved in miracles display. So the line attempted here, and was a brief overview of many of these questions. I hope this discussion can deepen a little bit the ideas here. The line attempted here has taken miracles as very special occasions of religious experiences and communication with the divine, and has put little weight on the famous thesis of violation of natural laws. So I think, as I said one day, the other day to Jeziel, I think it should be more a subject to philosophy of language, like Persp semiotics, than to the philosophy of science. So, and I hope this presentation has helped to clarify this fascinating religious concept. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agnaldo. And so let's begin the questions. Who is going to be the first one?
There are two
There are
hands
some
raised.
thanks. Very interesting, Agnaldo. I also can't agree with Hume's argument. At the beginning, he completely seems to believe that the natural laws are all discovered and that they are eternal, that they are, for us, according to the theories we have at the moment, the best approach to the behavior of nature. And you know that every time we can improve the theories and improve the comprehension of the laws respected by nature. And so the first premise cannot be acceptable. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think there's some relation to
Yes.
the violation of natural laws, but I think it's an accidental and less important one. So
no, I also think that miracles are some kind of break Of
It's
an
extraordinary event.
behavior,
And you
yes.
can say an extraordinary event could
Yes.
be taken as a violation of a natural law, but it doesn't need to be so.
Yes.
If you have miracles in the Bible, you don't have this this idea of natural laws. The technoscience is a very new cultural happening. So why taking this such a traditional and old concept as in this view? So well, you can say you need to reformulate miracles to conciliate with scientific activity, but I don't think we need to go on Hume's lines anyway.
But we accept that miracles are a certain kind of ruptures, of breaks. We accept that. Not very.
They need to be extraordinary.
Yes.
But they don't need to be unexplainable.
Yes. Gesiel?
Hi, thanks, Professor Ito. And thank you so much, Professor Agnaldo. As you know, I have thought also about miracles. We had an opportunity to exchange some thoughts in the last week. And it was a pleasure to watch your talk. I have many questions about your lecture, and I would like you to consider. I don't know how to begin because there's so much to talk about, but I cannot really see right. Thinking about the epistemological side, don't you think there is a dependence between your argument that epistemic considerations should be considered, but it all depends on the nature of miracles and the existence or possibility of miracles itself? Doesn't it is similar to the argument that it all depends on a de facto question, as I tried to show, if you remember, somebody who says testimonies are always lacking some epistemic dirty, and so we cannot say they are on their reason when they saw a miracle, but you said it all depends on the very possibility of miracles to happen. I would like to hear more from you about this epistemological side of the problem, miracles.
Well, I divided it between the a priori problem and the a posteriori problem, and I think that means there's something related to Plantinga's de jure objection. He says there's no de jure objection in the end because it depends on the de facto objection. So you can only say that the belief in miracles is irrational when you say no miracles are possible. But Hume cannot say that as a skeptic about the necessity involving natural laws. And I think even in the best philosophy of science today, don't think the natural laws are immutable. So and we don't need to think the physical closure of as part of nature in a realistic term. So we can think in it only in a methodological terms.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answer your question.
No, we can exchange more thoughts about that epistemological side in the future. I should read your paper as well, as it will clarify that side. But I think I would like you to consider if Itala permits
Yes,
an
yes,
additional question,
we have
because I
time.
have two more.
Let's enjoy
Yes.
the end of the meeting.
Okay, thanks. There is a question. Your argument was that miracles, when in Jesus' case, were due to some attempt to inspire communion of persons with God, right? So when persons met Jesus and he did some miracle, don't know, that was due to some attempt to inspire a communion between God and that person in particular. I would like to hear from you, what is then the value? I don't know if that is correct, because the secrecy of the miracles in the Gospels depend on the dynamics of the Gospel itself. In Mark, for instance, it happens always before Mark 8 or so, where Jesus reveals himself as Christ. So all this secrecy occurs mainly before this event. But okay, I think your thought is very inspiring. But I would like to hear from you, what is then the value of a miracle when we think about the public and a public demonstration? Yes, that could be seen by skeptical persons who would not believe that miracle. What is the intention of God while trying to show to skeptical persons who wouldn't believe in the first place that miracle, to show them that miracle? Could you please
Well, that's
share your
part
thoughts about it?
That's part of communication sometimes, isn't it? So we convey a message, and some people don't understand. So that's why semiotics could help us in
Yes.
comprehending miracles. People who are still studying Persp at Unicamp could help us with that, because if I'm right in saying that, and I'm not the only one, of course, in saying that miracles are mainly a communication phenomenon, I think the problem that some people don't understand is not what is intended by God who's performing that.
But Agnaldo, could we speak in Gisiel said so, intention of God, God's intention? Could we speak about that? About
the intention was to communicate, to show His glory, as they say in the Christian tradition. And the idea is that to people to get conversion and believe the gospel, isn't it? So the idea that miracles are part of that communication, I think.
Yes.
I agree.
There is a very good question by Evandro Gomes. I don't know if you want.
Professor Itala, I think that Ana Maria is the next one.
Ana Maria is with the hand. Sorry, I have 3 questions.
No problem. Thanks, Agnaldo. I like it very much.
Okay, you, please. Sorry.
Can I start? Okay, no problem. I'm enjoying the discussion.
I'm not used to see the hand.
Yeah. Agnaldo, I have some things to say. I agree with you with this proposal of religious approach to miracles. because I think that one cannot dissociate miracles, the happening of miracles, and the existence of God. Because not only the happenings of miracles defy science, but the very existence of God defies science. And I think that one cannot accept one aspect of this discussion and reject the other. Because as Dostoevsky has said, if God exists, then nothing is impossible. I think that the discussion about the existence of miracles is profoundly related to the discussion of the existence of God. But as to you mentioned the resurrection of Jesus as a very important example of a miracle. But I think that this example is complicated because Jesus was not like us. Our future resurrection as human beings is an event in Scaton that will be very different from the resurrection of Jesus, because Jesus was God, is God, and God has a peculiar ontological status. So in the literature, sometimes one puts together the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection, but I think there is a great difference between the two events, because Jesus was a human being, but also God. And you have already answered the ethical problem. I thought about the possible injustice. Why did the miracles happen only to few people, and the majority of the other people remain ill? And but you have answered this ethical issue. I agree with you. And at last, I would like to speak about this idea of subjective aspect of miracles. It has to do, in a way, with the placebo effect. I think I'm ill, I have a disease, I pray, and I am cured. And maybe because of my prayer, it has a subjective participation of myself. Like a placebo effect, but in a not so exact comparison. But what do you like to say about this idea of it's a miracle, I am cured, but I have a participation in it because I pray, and that helped me. Not only God, but I myself.
Prayer is another difficult issue, another difficult and very interesting subject in the philosophy of religion, and it does not have to do with miracles itself. Sometimes some prayers are not answered, but perhaps most of times, I'm afraid. But so it's a different issue. And so, yeah, but I forgot your first question. I'm sorry.
No, the difference
about
between
the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. Well,
and our resurrection.
The traditional concept is that miracles are a sign of God's power in an extraordinary way. So the resurrection of Jesus for the Christians are the most extraordinary sign of God's power and benevolence. So there's no problem if Jesus was not a human like us. It was a miracle, the biggest miracle for the Christian tradition, the central one, because of that, because of this religious meaning as a communication as a sign of God's power in a wonderful way.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I always love them.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. I'm going to Evandro Gomes' question and complemented by Nicola's comment. Professor Agnaldo, may miracles surpass laws of logic, even that extraordinarily? And then Nicola Claudio commented, Evandro, interesting. I think in the Thomistic tradition, as far as I know, God cannot perform something illogical. That is, he cannot stop being God or create a stone so heavy that even he cannot lift it. In Islam, there are less constraints to God's action.
I didn't understand about
the question,
the relationship between miracles and logic.
Miracles surpass laws of logic, I think.
No,
Yes.
don't need to. Actually, because, well, you as Clay are much better than me, but I think like Swinburne in saying that when you say that something is when you say that something is illogical, you're not saying something that's meaningful. So you don't need to require that a miracle be beyond a violation of the laws of logic. That's too strong. Not even Hume thought that. So it's not required for miracles.
The first question, where is Evandro? Which logic are you speaking about?
Yeah, well, that's another problem, isn't it?
That is the question. Classical Aristotelian logic. We are studying with Evandro, both Nicolau de Cusa. And for Nicolau de Cusa, God, there is no problem with consistency concerning God. Evandro?
Yeah, I propose the question because
Logic.
Miracles are a kind of suspension of laws of nature, isn't it? So, no?
No.
No?
That's exactly what I'm objecting to. It doesn't need to be. Can be, but doesn't need to be. It's not central to the concept at all.
But
think
a miracle is an exception.
It's an extraordinary event. It's very exceptional in this sense, but it's not in the sense of being a violation of the natural law. It's like saying that, as I said, it's a good joke among mathematicians. How do you tell a mathematician tells a children's story? You know that?
Yeah, yeah.
You know that? They say, you don't. How a mathematician tells us children's story. So as we finishing this event, we can be less formal, can we? So it's something like this. Let there be 3 peaks, P1, P2, and P3, so that for any Pn, Pi is little, and a wolf, W, by definition, big and bad. So this is axiom 1. So this is a very boring way of telling a children's story, isn't it? So if you can say that an axiom is a boring way of starting a children's story, that's not wrong. But it's just you're just missing the point about an axiom. You see? So saying that miracles are violation of natural law is not wrong. It's not central.
Yeah. Aguinaldo,
Okay, thank you.
could I complete or
Go ahead.
I agree with you. It's not central. It's not necessary for a miracle to break a natural law. It's not necessary, but it's possible. A miracle may break a natural law, and I think that a miracle also may break a law of logic. But we have to think which logic, which are the laws we are accepting. But I, in general, think that for any logic I can choose or elect as the best one or as the logic underlying my thoughts, even for this logic, a miracle may break one of its laws. May, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Well, but there are many ways of being an extraordinary happening.
Yeah.
Violating a law of nature, violating a law of logic can be ways of being an extraordinary happening.
Yeah.
It does.
Excellent. A miracle may be an unexpected surprise, for instance, no?
Yeah, well, Eugene Nagasawa, he wrote a book about a very short introduction to miracles. And he said that would be too weak to say that a big coincidence. He mentions a happening, something that happened in the US in 1950. Do you know that? It's there was a big explosion in a church in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly at the time of the church choir had his weekly rehearsal. So these 15 people who attended the rehearsal were very punctual. They never failed the rehearsal. But on that very day, when the church was when the church exploded by a gas problem, nobody attended the rehearsal. There are very many different problems of reasons. So can you say that happening was a miracle?
Yes, good question. Yes.
This big coincidence, 15 people didn't attend, they did not die. Can you say that was a miracle? They thought it was a sign of God's power in an extraordinary way. And I think they were right in taking that as a miracle.
Yes. Aguinaldo, there is a last question by Humberto Coelho arriving in the YouTube chat. I will read to you. It reminds me of a passage in Rudolf Otto's Life and Ministry of Jesus, when he argues for a scientific investigation of some marvelous deeds of Jesus. It's not a question, it's just an observation.
Yeah, I don't know that book.
Yeah.
But
how to say
I'm afraid that we are run of time.
Yes.
So.
We have 3 other questions. Well,
okay.
If you...
I would like to thank again Professor Aguinaldo Portugal for the excellent and provocative talk. And I think that I have to close the talk and to ask the organizers to close the meeting, and probably Fabio and Giselle would like to assume.
Okay, thank you, Professor Itala. Thank you, Professor Agnaldo. It was a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much. We have a lot to think about. Well, let's finish our incredible meeting. Thank you. I would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for the generous funding that made this conference possible. I thank the team of the Center for Logic, Epistemology, and the History of Science of the University of Campinas for all the support they gave us, students, professors, researchers. I appreciate the participation and support of all of you speakers, chairs, professors, students, colleagues, and friends. I'm very pleased with the contributions presented in the talks, as well as the discussions that took place. I hope we have soon the opportunity to meet in person. Stay healthy, people. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Fábio.
Congratulations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Aí, gente.
Stop the live stream.